to week 3 of Bible for Grown-Ups. I'm really excited about this week because we're actually covering the most important step in Bible study. What is the most important step in Bible study? So let's first ask this question. What does the Bible and paint have in common? What does the Bible and paint have in common? And if you didn't guess it, they both have to be applied. Now, I know that sounds like a really bad dad joke, but Jesus has a lot to say about the truth being applied to our life. The Bible, just like paint, really does have to be applied. But just don't take my word for it. Let's look at what Jesus has to say in Matthew chapter 7. He says this to his disciples. He says, "Therefore, everyone who hears these words of mine and puts them into practice is like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain came down and the streams rose and the winds blew and beat against the house, yet it did not fall because it's had its foundation on the rock." Okay? And then conversely, he continues, "But everyone who hears these words of mine and does not put them into practice is like a foolish man who built his house on sand. The rains came down, the streams rose, and the winds blew and beat against the house, and it fell with a great crash." Interesting enough for Jesus is he's giving this little example to his followers was simply to say this, that the crash, in a sense, did not come because of a lack of truth, because both heard the truth, but the crash because one did not apply the truth. He says, if you are going to apply what I say and apply my teachings, then it's as if your foundation is firm and solid. But if you know truth but don't apply the teachings of Jesus, then you're basically setting up yourself up for a crash. And not only that, but James would come along and he said this, and it's pretty brilliant. The younger brother Jesus, he said this, that do not merely listen to the word and so deceive yourself. Do what it says. He's basically saying that truth by itself can almost lead us to a place of deception because we've all been there. We know truth and we know enough truth that we can help everyone else out and yet not even take our own advice. So we've all kind of been in that situation. But James says we should live differently. Verse 23, he says, anyone who listens to the word but does not do what it says is like someone who looks at his face in a mirror. And then he says this, and after he's looking at himself, goes away and immediately forgets what he looks at. And he says this in verse 25, but whoever looks intently into the perfect law that gives freedom and continues in it, not forgetting what he've just heard, but doing it, they will be blessed in what they do. James is basically saying there is a blessing in not just knowing the scripture, there's a blessing when people follow the scripture. So again, it's not what you learned, it's what you applied. So when we start talking about Bible study, really Jesus doesn't want us just to be a smarter follower of his. He wants us to be a disciple that will literally put what we study into practice. So the question then is what is the most important step in Bible study? It's simply this, application. So the way we approach the Bible, the most important part is then how do we take the Bible and apply it to our life? As we just discussed, we need to have an application in front and center in regards to studying the Bible. Because Jesus is pretty obvious when he says it's not just about being smarter followers. We need to be disciples that actually take to heart what he says and actually apply it to our life. So in choosing a Bible study method, we have to make sure that application is a major part of that. So I want to teach you just one Bible study method that I feel like is really easy and very simple to apply. I think anybody can do this. It's called the SOAP method. The SOAP method is divided up in kind of four different parts. You have scripture, observation, application, and prayer. And the SOAP method is a way for you and I to, in a sense, when we study the Bible, is to journal and make sure we're keeping application front and center. So let me just kind of explain to you kind of how this works with an example from my SOAP method or my SOAP journal. And it first starts off with step one, which is have a Bible reading plan. Now, I know some people like to take the Bible and they'll take and just kind of scroll through, okay, what do I want to study today? And just kind of play popcorn in a sense with the Bible. I don't think that's the best way. I think the intentionality of starting with the book of the Bible and read from the first all the way until you're done with that book of the Bible can help you get the most out of it, not just jumping around from different sections. So some Bible reading plans, you can kind of, they're about subject matters, and some you can just do all different kinds of options out there. But one of my favorite is just take a book of the Bible, go from start until the finish. And then when I read a new book of the Bible, or a book of the Bible that I'm reading, I'll go to step two, which is read the overview, the date, and the context for the book. And what I want to just highlight is I absolutely love Life Application Bibles. Life Application Bible has this beautiful introduction to each book of the Bible. So I just do a quick 2 minutes and I get a great context as I'm reading through the entire book. And it's always found at the beginning of each book, okay? And then step three, I'll read a chapter a day and highlight any verses that stick out. So I'm reading through the chapter, and whatever chapter that day, I'll have my highlighter and highlight a verse out of that chapter, and then I will apply that verse through the SOAP method. Actually, step four, I'll write out that verse that I highlighted in a notebook and apply the SOAP method. So let me just kind of share with you how it works as an example. First of all, I read through Ecclesiastes. At that time, in my Bible reading plan, I was reading through Ecclesiastes. And of course, I would get the overview, the date, and the context of the Ecclesiastes. And so a part of that, when you go to the beginning of the book of Ecclesiastes, you'll see some interesting kind of thoughts there that kind of theologians can help you understand that book. And so here is kind of what I discovered, again, just from the Life Application Bible. I found the purpose was to spare future generations the bitterness of learning through their own experience that life apart from God is meaningless. And so I discovered that, again, just in my application, the Life Application Bible. The author of Ecclesiastes is Solomon, and we also find who the original audience is: Solomon's subjects and all people in general. Because this is kind of written to the audience at large. The date of composition was about 935 BC, and this was late in Solomon's life. This is an interesting thought, because as you read through Ecclesiastes, it sounds like someone who's gone through a whole lot. And here's the setting. The reflections in this book arose as King Solomon looked back on his life, some of which had been lived apart from God. So I got all the context that I need to really start tackling the scripture. And so for me, in this portion of my journal, I read through chapter 7, and I'm reading through chapter 7, and all of a sudden, chapter 10, or verse 10 really stood out to me. And this is what Ecclesiastes 7:10 said. And this is the scripture portion. Do not say, why were these old days better than these? For it is not wise to ask such questions. Now, as I'm reading through chapter 7, this verse just really pops out at me. And so I just highlight that verse. And do you know what I did? I just took that verse and put it in my journal and just wrote out that verse. And then I did the O, which is the observation. I'm, in a sense, doing the interpretation that we talked about earlier, which is Solomon is telling his audience not to live in the past. Don't dwell on past successes or overanalyze them. Learn to live in the moment. Solomon is making this bold declaration here that sometimes we live in the past or look to the future too much. And so we really need to live in the moment and don't miss the moment. So in that moment, in my journal, I wrote down that observation, but then I went to the application, which is the most important part of the Bible study. So I said, as I wrote down in my journal, today, think forward, forget past problems and successes, start with a clean slate and live in the moment. And so the important part of this study, of the application part, is where I got really specific. For me, it was all about thinking forward. And sometimes it's easy to get enamored by our past successes. So for me, in that moment in my life, I was thinking, you know what? I really need to think forward, not really get so caught up in the past with past problems or even past successes. And so I take that application, and then I concluded my journal with a prayer. I, in a sense, wrote this prayer out. I said, God, today I commit to keep my eyes forward and not to get too satisfied with past successes. I use this time in the prayer portion to commit this to God of what I just read, this application of thinking forward, that I wanted to keep my eyes forward and not get so enamored with the past. And so this was an awesome way to not only see that scripture, interpret that scripture, but then apply that scripture to my life. Okay, so now you saw an example out of my journal. Let's just do a quick overview of really what the SOAP method is all about. Again, it starts with the scripture. That means I'm going to be reading through a book of the Bible, and I'm going to be, in a sense, doing about a chapter a day. And when I see a verse that stands out at me, I'm going to highlight that thing and then transfer that verse into my own notebook. And then I observe. And in a sense, what I'm saying is, what is the one thing the author is trying to communicate to his original audience? It's in the O of SOAP that helps us interpret that scripture. Because we first have to know what the author's saying to the original audience before we can go into the A portion, which is the next one, the application. So after I've read the scripture, wrote the scripture, did a little observation about the original audience, then I'm ready to apply it. I'm ready to, in a sense, ask the question, how am I going to be different today as the result of what I just read? And here is the most important part of the application portion, and that is be specific. As long as you stay vague and generalized, nothing really changes. It's when we're very specific to say, I see how I can apply this specifically in my life, things begin to change. And of course, the last one is to take the application and then form it into a time of commitment to God for what you just read in a form of a prayer. Maybe ask for help in the areas that you need to change. And again, what you're doing here is you're taking the scripture, the observation, the application, prayer, and you're applying this portion of scripture to your life. Now it's your turn. Now I want you to have a lot of fun with this new Bible study method.